As a society, I just think it's so unacceptable that we've chosen not to care for people who are truly ill.
Civil commitment, it's not to be taken lightly.
Clearly, I was making decisions that put myself in harm's way.
How do we keep people from ever getting to that point?
On May 24th, dozens of Portland police officers rushed to the MAX stop at Cascade Station, not far from the Portland International Airport. Investigators would later explain how a man named Marcus Tate took 2 people hostage on the MAX train, armed with a knife and a barbecue skewer. After a standoff and negotiations with Tate, a special police unit fired 2 flashbang grenades, stunning Tate before taking him into custody and rescuing the hostages. Tate pleaded not guilty to multiple felony charges. But there's more to that story. Police officers had stopped Tate just the night before. They said he had a physical altercation with officers during an apparent mental health crisis. Officers took Tate to the hospital for a mental health evaluation. Then he was released the very next morning, just hours before the incident on the MAX train. Tate's situation is far from unique, and it highlights a mental health system with frustrating gaps, especially when someone needs urgent mental health care and refuses to voluntarily seek help. KGW analyzed court and government records. We found less than 7% of people in Multnomah County who were considered dangerous enough to warrant a forced mental health hold received a civil commitment ruling from a judge. Police also report that hundreds of times each year, they take someone to a hospital for mental health care only to later encounter them again, experiencing another apparent mental health crisis.
To get the person to the hospital and then to learn that they were released right away, it's also kind of underscores that the system is imperfect.
When a person refuses mental health care, doctors and evaluators are left with a tough question.
The investigator's not determining whether or not they need treatment, but whether or not we can force that person to get the treatment that's recommended.
Kathy Shoemate leads a team of behavioral health workers in Multnomah County. They're charged with investigating severe cases of mental illness to see if civil commitment is recommended or justified.
And the idea is that if you're experiencing severe symptoms of your mental illness, then your judgment about your behavior and what you need to do is impaired. Were it not impaired, you might make different choices.
The civil commitment process is complicated, but here's an overview of how it works. A person experiencing an apparent mental health crisis may be placed on a temporary hold, often by a behavioral health worker or a police officer. Then, a doctor evaluates to see if that person meets standards for an involuntary hold. If they do, the doctor issues a notice of mental illness, or NMI. County investigators have 3 days to review the medical assessment. If they agree with the NMI, a court hearing is scheduled. Then a judge decides if that person meets the legal criteria for civil commitment, which could mean up to 6 months of forced care in a medical facility. If at any point in the process the person agrees to voluntary treatment, they're released from the hold. The key here is the high standard for civil commitment. In Oregon and Washington, evaluators must judge that a person's mental illness makes them dangerous to themselves or others.
There's a reason the bar and the threshold is so high as it is.
Civil liberties are important. It shouldn't be easy to commit someone.
Casey Lewis, working with Disability Rights Oregon, says holding someone against their will is normally only used when someone's committed a crime, not when they're ill.
The standards for civil commitment should be high because people with mental illness belong in their communities. I think the fact that so few people end up committed is a sign that the threshold is appropriate.
It wasn't always this way. Current standards are reflective of a decades-long shift away from state institutionalism for mental health treatment. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy introduced and signed the Community Mental Health Act into law. He said people with mental illness must not be alien to our affections and apart from our community.
Our chief aim is to get people out of state custodial institutions and back into their communities and homes without hardship or danger.
A year earlier, Ken Kesey's novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was published, criticizing mental health treatment. The book was set in an Oregon psychiatric hospital. Over the decades to come, states adopted new civil commitment laws and shifted responsibility from state hospitals to counties. Data from the State Library of Oregon shows there were more than 5,000 beds in use in state mental hospitals in 1954. 30 years later, only 30% of those beds remained. Since 2002, Oregon has had about 700 beds available for state psychiatric use. And now, the Oregon State Hospital rarely houses civil commitment patients. In 2019, OSH shifted admission priorities to focus on people awaiting criminal trials. For example, people who are guilty except for insanity. For more than a year, the state hospital has averaged less than 20 civil commitment patients per month, forcing local hospitals to provide long-term care.
This shift in treatment is one thing, but the reality is the vast majority of people don't come anywhere close to civil commitment. Many people don't meet state standards for being a danger to themselves or others, so they're released from care, still experiencing significant symptoms of their mental illness. Could that then lead to a cycle where you're seeing some of these issues pop up again and again?
It can. It can.
Isn't that frustrating?
It's very frustrating.
Brenda Gardner says in the case of her son Eric, her family ran out of options for help.
A lot of the problem is that the laws were changed so that their civil rights are what is all important, and their safety is not.
Gone too far that direction.
Way too far that direction.
If someone refuses treatment, housing, or help, she says we've accepted a system that fails to help people when they need it.
But as far as I'm concerned, the homeless situation is an open-air psych ward. It's those people that should be in psychiatric facilities or in supported housing with a caseworker that checks on them, are instead living on the streets and being treated like animals. I thought he was just the typical obnoxious teenager. Eric was always very social. He was athletic, he had played high school basketball, and good sense of humor. In his senior year of college at the University of Washington, we started to notice some changes.
Brenda Gardner remembers her son Eric telling her something was wrong. Eric was in his early 20s when he told his parents he needed brain surgery. Brenda and her husband brought Eric home from college to see a doctor. That's when they first experienced the terrifying symptoms of his mental illness.
Spittle coming out his mouth, in my face, screaming at me. His parting shot was, "And if you try to make me see a shrink, you'll never see me again." We had never seen anything like that before. And then that kind of behavior just continued. This really volatile, and then just not being in reality, that became much worse over time.
Eric threatened to kill his family members, expressing delusions, acting aggressively, and sending violent and disturbing text messages.
We put contraptions on each side of the door frame and ran a bar through it at night so that he had threatened to kill us. We were afraid he could just break down the door and come in and kill us at night.
After one outburst, police arrested Eric and ordered him not to contact his parents. But after 6 weeks of staying with family friends, Eric returned home.
We had no history of this in our family. It can happen to anyone, and it's not Eric's fault. What I say is, he's the victim. We're just collateral damage.
After a suicide scare, mental health evaluators placed Eric on a hospital hold, forcing him to get treatment. He took medicine, some of his symptoms stabilized, and he was released. But his psychosis later returned.
It just can't last, right? I mean, they can try really hard to hold it together, and maybe they go through a period where it works for a little while, but at some point, it crumbles.
Eric is now living homeless in Seattle and still suffering from mental illness. After years of trying to find solutions, Brenda Gardner said she felt helpless. Eric turned down treatment, but he didn't meet requirements for forced mental health care, also known as civil commitment. The state can force someone to stay in a medical facility and receive treatment for up to 6 months, but only if they've proven to be dangerous to themselves or others.
I think that should be his right to refuse medication, but I think that he should be in supported housing, or if that was the only choice, I'd rather have him hospitalized than spending winters on the street.
Gardner says our mental health system's failure to get people like Eric the help they need is directly contributing to the homeless crisis. She says if a person doesn't choose housing for people with severe mental illness, which is already very limited with long wait lists, they're left to fend for themselves.
KGW reviewed Multnomah County data between 2013 and 2021. Of the thousands of people who showed mental illness symptoms dangerous enough to warrant a forced hold, less than 7% received a civil commitment ruling from a judge. Most people didn't make it that far.
Some of these people agreed to voluntary treatment, exiting the process. Many others, like Eric, were released because they didn't meet state standards, left to take care of themselves.
As far as I'm concerned, the homeless situation is an open-air psych ward. It's those people that should be in psychiatric facilities or in supported housing with a caseworker that checks on them, are instead living on the streets and being treated like animals.
But each person's experience with this process is different. Laureen remembers sitting in the back of a police car in Washington County, on the way to a hospital on a mental health hold.
I had some beliefs that weren't accurate and put myself in harm's way. I easily could have gone to jail for trespassing. I was making people afraid because I was not acting like the person that they knew. They're like, what is going on with her?
She knew people were concerned about her mental health.
Things weren't right, but nobody could figure it out.
Except this time she was forced to stay in a hospital as doctors evaluated her mental illness.
It was only when I couldn't leave, I was like, oh.
It's different this time.
Because I couldn't leave. I wanted to leave.
A doctor said Laureen's mental illness was a danger to herself, filing a notice of mental illness. Laureen was diagnosed with bipolar 1 and put on new medication. Then something changed. Laureen says she's fortunate. Her symptoms became more manageable. She started agreeing to treatment.
I just remember at a certain point, everybody kind of agreed, well, she's doing everything we're asking her to do, as opposed to if I had refused to participate in treatment, then it could have been different.
Laureen is an example of a voluntary diversion, when a person being held against their will agrees to a plan to treat their mental illness.
You'd say in your case, the system worked well.
Yes. I don't know if I would be alive, and it's hard to know what would have happened if somebody hadn't stepped in. I know my life would be a lot different.
Now she works as peer support for other people experiencing the civil commitment process, telling them she's been there, it'll be okay, even if she knows forced treatment doesn't always work out like it did for her.
But I do acknowledge that there are people that do slip through the cracks every single day, and that breaks my heart. I was very delusional. I really couldn't participate in anything.
As a community, we need to come together and determine what is acceptable.
There are more times than not where I'm like, are you kidding me? They didn't do more? This person clearly is suffering.
It's August 2020. A man diagnosed with bipolar disorder leaves his house in St. Paul, Oregon. He starts a 30-mile walk to Portland, saying he's on a mission to resolve protests in the city. Earlier, he covered himself in bleach and household chemicals, saying the government was exposing him to radiation, according to his brother. This man's erratic and delusional behaviors are laid out in an Oregon Court of Appeals case. His story gives us a glimpse at the process when the state tries to force someone into mental health treatment, what's known as civil commitment. It also shows that with civil commitment, the bar is very high. In this case, a lower circuit court judge argued this man's mental illness was dangerous to his own health. But appellate court judges disagreed. They overturned his commitment, saying he didn't meet Oregon standards. Those judges said the man didn't drink the bleach, and his attempted walk to Portland, while inherently risky, didn't result in physical harm.
Cases like that one show the complexities of ordering mental health care for someone who doesn't want it. But the reality is, very few mental health holds even reach a judge.
KGW filed public records requests for civil commitment data in Multnomah County. When evaluating a patient on a temporary mental health hold, a doctor may file a Notice of Mental Illness, or NMI, which indicates they think a patient is a threat to themselves or others, so they should be held involuntarily. Our review found the number of NMIs filed by doctors in Multnomah County decreased significantly over recent years, from about 5,000 in 2013 down to 2,600 in 2021. Even more, most of those who received NMIs were released from forced care before a court hearing. They either agreed to recommended voluntary treatment, or county behavioral health workers reviewed the doctor's decision and determined the patient didn't warrant forced treatment. Kathy Shoemate works with Multnomah County's behavioral health team. She says they're often forced to make tough choices.
The doctor's like, oh my gosh, don't you see how symptomatic they are? How can you let them go? It's like, I understand, I agree, and the law says we're not at a point where we can force this to happen.
Sometimes mental health conditions can stabilize with medication, housing, and care, decreasing the perceived danger to the patient or the community.
Can we divert this person from civil commitment? Or do we not have the probable cause to take this forward to court?
About 12% of people who received an NMI in Multnomah County in the last 8 years received a court hearing. About 7% ended up with a civil commitment ruling from a judge. When someone experiencing a mental health crisis starts the process towards civil commitment, their first interaction is often with either a behavioral health worker or a police officer. Those are the people who first recognize the issues and bring someone to a hospital for evaluation.
Wanting to try and do what's best for the community, what's best for the person that is suffering or in the mental health crisis.
Lieutenant Chris Burley works with the Portland Police Bureau's Behavioral Health Unit. When a person commits a crime while showing signs of a mental health crisis, Burley says officers are trained to weigh whether a mental health hold and a hospital trip would be more productive than incarceration. But this can be frustrating. Officers don't know when someone is released from the hospital because of medical privacy laws. Sometimes they find the same person experiencing another crisis just days or weeks after they drop them off for evaluation.
The officer's trying to determine, okay, I tried, one avenue, that didn't work. I believe the person has mental illness. Now, what am I supposed to do if I know that, if I believe if I'm going to take the person to the hospital, they might be released right away.
That can create this cycle.
Yes, yeah. It feels like, we're not treating all of our community members the way that with the dignity and respect that they deserve.
Between May 2020 and April 2022, the Portland Police Bureau issued 3,057 temporary mental health holds, about 4 every day. In at least 13% of cases, the patient had been the subject of a hold in the past, meaning officers had judged them to be dangerous to themselves or the community. They were brought to the hospital, released, and then placed on a hold again. This number is also likely an undercount, as PPB couldn't identify more than 600 people who didn't have ID or give their name during the mental health hold. Other agencies and workers can issue holds too, and that's not reflected in police data. Cascadia Health and its Project Respond team initiated 524 holds in 2021. About 2/3 of these holds were duplicates, involving someone who was placed on more than one hold by behavioral health workers last year. It can also be hard for responders to differentiate from severe mental illness symptoms and drug use symptoms. Even if someone is diagnosed with a mental illness, doctors aren't allowed to compel treatment if they believe the person's threatening behavior was caused by drugs or alcohol.
If they have any type of substance on board, they oftentimes get released. And we need to recognize that we can't separate the two. How can we provide them the wraparound services so that they don't get to that crisis point?
Crisis points that are described in detail through civil commitment appeals cases. In July 2021, Judges upheld a commitment for a man, initials DA, who had stalked a fitness instructor at a Clackamas County gym. He had been civilly committed twice before, in 2015 and 2017, for stalking other people. This time, a county investigator was about to release DA from his hold, but just before his release, DA assaulted 3 other patients at Cedar Hills Hospital, saying they were trash and he needed to take out the trash. In another case, appellate judges reversed a civil commitment ruling for a woman who threatened to kill her neighbors, nonprofit staffers, and animal service workers over delusions about her cats, saying they couldn't prove actual future violence is highly likely.
And that becomes case law. It continues to raise that bar when commitments get overturned, and the appellate court says that's not enough.
But judges affirmed a commitment when a man threatened people in his apartment complex with a large kitchen knife and acted physically aggressive towards hospital staff. It was this case and the current legal standard that prompted Judge Stephen Powers to comment on the civil commitment process, acknowledging issues with our current system and how this cycle may not help people with severe mental illness. Powers wrote, "Maintaining a high bar for civil commitments may have the unintended consequence of failing to address mental illness before similar conduct leads to criminal charges and consequently the person's entry into the criminal justice system." Many people involved in the civil commitment process, from family members to doctors, to behavioral health workers to police and judges, say the state standards for forced mental health care need to be reviewed.
You know, civil commitment laws haven't changed significantly since they were written in the 70s. The needs have changed. Treatment options have changed. Treatment programs have changed.
Kathy Shumate leads a team of investigators in Multnomah County. She says civil commitment should be a last resort, but it may be time for everyone to ask, is the bar where it should be?
This is such an important law and such an important process that impacts people's lives so significantly that I think to let it sit idle in the statutes doesn't serve us well. It doesn't serve our community well, and I don't think it serves people who are living with mental illness well.
Our KGW investigation found about 90% of people taken to a Multnomah County hospital on a forced mental health hold were released within 5 days, before a judge could rule on any civil commitment. Many of these people may have agreed to treatment, but thousands of people were released because they didn't meet state standards, even though police officers or behavioral health workers said their apparent mental illness symptoms were dangerous to themselves or others.
Understanding that the bar is that high to protect the civil liberties of the individual, is it at the same time possible that the status of that bar being high could lead to an individual not receiving either recommended care or the care that they would need?
It does. They may be discharged from a treatment setting without the length or level of treatment that's recommended, and they leave that place continuing to experience significant symptoms of their illness.
Judges have written that high standards could be an issue, preventing some people from getting help before they end up in jail. Portland Police Lieutenant Chris Burley says officers feel frustrated, perpetuating a cycle of taking someone to a hospital for mental health treatment, only to later find them in crisis again.
I do think as a community we need to come together and say, as a state, are we comfortable with where it's at right now?
Burley says people with severe mental illness can be released because their illness stabilizes in the hospital, only to deteriorate again on their own.
But I think it is telling, like, they got a bed, they got meals, they have a roof over their head.
Treatment.
Some treatment. For some folks, that's what they need. So why would we stop providing that?
But Casey Lewis with Disability Rights Oregon says not so fast. He admits there are gaps in the civil commitment system, but says focusing on the law is misguided.
So I think rather than looking at the standard for civil commitment, really the thing that would make the biggest difference for people with mental illness and for the community would be to say, how do we keep people from ever getting to that point?
Lewis says the bar is high to protect individual rights, and so few people are civilly committed because mental health workers rightfully encourage any other option first, like voluntary treatment. Instead, Lewis says we need to do a better job of caring for people when they're released from a mental health hold.
We need to be having more resources available in the community, more placements for people who maybe need wraparound services, who need more supportive housing, who need medication management, things like that.
What can we do if the individual's buy-in isn't there, if it's not voluntarily something they will accept or seek out?
9 times out of 10, if you are able to sort of spend more time with a person with mental illness, really understand what they need, there are ways to connect them with those resources, even if they are initially reluctant. You can build that trust, and you can build the relationship that it really takes to do that.
For Brenda Gardner, fixing this cycle for people with severe mental illness is personal. She and her husband spent years trying to find help for their son Eric, who experienced violent thoughts and delusions. Housing was a major problem.
As a parent, would you have hoped for something like civil commitment, for stability of medication or something like that?
Yes, if there was a decent facility available. He's functional enough. If he had a little bit of support in, a supported housing, I think he could manage.
She says the entire community suffers for failing to help people with serious mental illness symptoms, pointing out an overlap with the homeless crisis and, at times, drug addiction and crime. Eric Gardner is now homeless in Seattle. Sometimes his parents have been able to visit him, but they wish there was more they could do.
The problem is that the laws were changed so that their civil rights are what is all important, and their safety is not.